Hello everybody, I've got a 2000 Ford Ranger 3-liter 4-wheel drive flex fuel that is in need of a new transmission. The one that's in there is still operating but has a lot of problems in shifting, and so going to be replacing the transmission today. And this video is designed to capture exactly that procedure using only just hand tools. So before we get started, I want to say that I'm a pastor and a Christian, and that there's a lot more important things in life than trucks and transmissions. So if you get a chance, cruise over to the other videos on my channel and take a peek at those, and hopefully those and this one will help you in a variety of ways. So let's get started. Before we get started, we need to review a few things you're going to have in place before you begin any work on your truck. First of all, you'll need a good pair of ramps in order to elevate the truck sufficiently. We'll do that in just a moment. Also, you're going to need a transmission jack. It's just about impossible to remove the transmission and install another without a good transmission jack. You'll want a creeper, and beyond that, you're going to also want to have some things on hand, including new transmission fluid. This truck takes about 11 quarts, I believe, and so you'll want to have that on hand. I also have a few other things handy as well. I have the gaskets that are needed for things like the exhaust, and also the transfer case to the bell housing of the transmission, the rear bell housing of the transmission. So there's a gasket that goes between there. You'll also want that as well. And the last item you'll need is a new torque converter. If you're going to replace the transmission, it doesn't make a lot of sense not to go ahead and replace the torque converter. Inside of the torque converter there's a lockup clutch, and it is not serviceable, so there's no way to make repairs or replace it. So the only option is to replace the torque converter, and since it's buried deep inside of the transmission, there's no sense in not replacing it if you're going to go through all this trouble. So those are the items I think you'll want to have on hand before you begin. The thing that I would like to do is to evaluate exactly how high do I need to elevate the truck in order to get the transmission underneath when I replace this one. So what I've done is I've got the replacement transmission. This one has been rebuilt on the jack stand, on the transmission jack. And I just want to take the opportunity to measure how far it is and how much clearance I need. And so it appears to me, with the transmission tipped just a bit, I'm right at about 23 inches. So I need to make sure that the truck is elevated to that degree in order to get the transmission in. I wouldn't want to get the transmission all loose and unbolted and then realize that I don't have sufficient height to remove it from underneath the bottom of the truck. So looks like about 24 or so inches. Okay, got the truck all jacked up here using the ramps in the front. They chalk the front wheels because with the rear elevated, there's nothing to prevent the truck from rolling. So I want to make sure it was secure. The back is on jack stands, and they're extended as high as I can get them. You can see. And I believe I'm pretty close, but might need to raise it a little more. We'll see. Right now I'm at about 24, 25 inches. Got a subframe under there, so I don't know if I can weave the transmission with that little bit of extra or not. We'll see. But at least I'm pretty close. If I do have to raise it, it'll be minimal and should be ready for the next step. Okay, I've done a couple of things inside of the engine compartment by way of preparation. So the first thing I've done is remove the negative terminal of the battery cable. Always a good idea for any major repair. And then also I have removed the spark plugs and labeled the spark plug wires. And the reason I did that was because later on I'm going to need to turn the flywheel to gain access to the studs of the torque converter. And so in order to do that, I would like to not have to overcome the compression of the cylinders. And so by removing the spark plugs, that alleviates that pressure and should allow me to turn the flywheel freely as I need to access those bolts. Underneath the truck now, and the first major component I want to deal with is the transfer case. So just to give you some orientation, transmission is here. There's the transmission pan. Behind is the transfer case. This is 4-wheel drive. So you need to do a couple of things. I need to first remove the rear drive shaft. and also the front drive shaft. Those are simply unbolted here and all the way down at the rear end. Should drop right out. Same is true of the front drive shaft. I need to unplug this electrical connector here that controls the switching unit inside the transfer case. Need to remove this damper as well. Once I get those things taken off, I'll shoot another video, but the next procedure would be to physically unbolt the transfer case from the rear of the transmission. Bolts are around the housing here. So we'll take a peek at that in just a minute. Let's get these drive shafts off first. I want to mention, as you remove the drive shafts, you'll want to make sure before you unbolt them that you mark with maybe some paint like this the orientation between the drive shaft and its accompanying component, so that when you reinstall the pieces that you'll have them back in their right orientation. Otherwise they can be unbalanced and give you some vibration. So I've marked this one. I've marked all of them in 4 places, both the front and the back of the front and the rear drive shafts. Okay, I wanted to mention that if you have difficulty accessing the bolts on the drive shaft, you can always put the truck in neutral and simply turn the wheels and gain access to the ones that are on top. Since I have the rear drive shaft out, I want to go ahead and service the drive shaft. The drive shafts in many Rangers and F-150s have a problem with the slip yoke sticking, giving you a bump at acceleration at the end of deceleration. So the remedy for this is to lubricate the slip yoke, which I've done here on the splines and here on the receiver. It's important that you use the correct lubricant. This is put out by Ford. It's called PTFE lubricant. This can was about $30, but anyway, on the back of the can, I'm sure you can't read that, but it eliminates grunt type noise in drive shaft slip yokes. And I've also taken the opportunity to replace the boot as well, because the one that was on here was really cracked, so I think there may have been some moisture slipping in and diminishing the lubricant as well. Pretty simple procedure, so just cutting off the bands, lubricating the slip yoke, and then reinstalling a new boot. The tool, by the way, to do that with is just a standard CV boot clamp pliers. So pretty straightforward, but since I have this out, I thought I'd go ahead and take care of it. Okay, I've got the front drive shaft out, and I thought I might highlight a couple of items that would be helpful to you. So at the very front of the drive shaft, this universal joint is held into the front rear end with these clasp and bolts. And these are pretty easy to take out. They weren't terribly difficult. Just need the right tool to fit that Torex screw. This guy. The back was a little stubborn as it rusted into the transfer case, and so you remove these 6 bolts, but it was stuck pretty firm. So it took a hammer working around this ridge to break it free. Now once it broke free, it slid right out, but it was rusted on there pretty good. So that's taken care of. Front and rear drive shafts are out, and the next thing I want to do is remove the transfer case dampener, and then we'll be ready to get pretty close to removing the transfer case itself. Okay, one other item you want to take care of under the hood is to go ahead and remove the transmission fluid dipstick, as that'll get in the way later, so might as well go ahead and get rid of it now. Okay, the transfer case is out, so I want to give you a close-up view of what it looks like and how to remove it. It's held in by 5 13mm head bolts, and here's the location of each. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's pretty simple conceptually to remove this by just unbolting it. However, it was extremely difficult to have access to all of the bolts. Obviously, the ones on the bottom were fairly straightforward. The ones on the top, a couple of those were extremely difficult to remove. I only used an open-ended wrench and a socket to remove them. It just took a lot of patience. I'd say about an hour's time to remove those 5. In many cases, you're only able to advance the bolt by maybe 1/8 of a turn per attempt, and so it just takes lots and lots of repetitive motions to get those out of there. When the transfer case was unbolted, I actually had the transmission jack underneath it, and it already chained to it, and that was a really good idea because, as you can see, the transfer case is a really odd shape, and so the jack alone is not enough. It's got to be chained, because when it came loose, I used a pry bar just to gently slide it out of engagement of the transmission, but because it's such an odd shape, the chain was the only thing that really held it to the transmission jack. So nonetheless, a little awkward to remove. It also made a mess because there's transmission fluid that flows from the transmission to the transfer case, and as you can see, I've got some cleanup to do here. But it is out, and so the next step will be to begin working with the exhaust and the starter, and then once that's done, we'll be ready to start on the transmission proper. So I'll shoot another video as soon as I get those things underway. Okay, so I just want to spend some time cleaning up the transfer case. It's a real mess. Part of it is a lot of the gasket tore apart as I separated the two. So what I'm going to do is a couple of things. First of all, I have taken a sandwich bag with a rubber band and covered the input shaft of the torque converter to keep debris from falling down in there. And then I'm just going to take a straight edge razor and remove all of the old gasket and get it really nice and clean for the new gasket to be on there. And then I'm also going to spend some time just cleaning up some of this garbage that is collected over the years, and just putting this back into the best order I can make it before reinstalling it later with the transmission. Okay, I've got the transfer case nice and cleaned up, at least as best as I can. Most of the dirt and grime is off of it now, so I'm pretty satisfied with that. I've also got the new gasket just placed here. Wanted to make sure it was a good fit, and it was the correct one. Again, this is one of the parts you'd want to pre-order, because when I removed the transfer case, it obviously destroyed the old gasket. It's just a paper gasket. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is begin thinking about the exhaust, because some of the exhaust has got to come off in order to remove the transfer case, or excuse me, the transmission. So what I'm going to do is take some of this PB Blaster and go underneath the truck and go ahead and spray some of the exhaust fittings, because this exhaust has been on here for 15 years. And so I know that in places like here, and also up near the catalytic converter, right there, and then also up a little further, I don't know if you can see this, if I can even get a shot of it, up to where it connects to the manifolds up there, is going to be really rusty, and it's going to take some time to get these joints broken loose. So just going to spray this down, take a break for a little while, and come back and see if I can free those up. Ultimately, what I want to do is remove the catalytic converter portion and the Y pipe so that I have access to the transmission. So be back soon with another video. Okay, the PB Blaster has had a chance to sit a little bit. So before I take the bolts out here on the exhaust system, I'm taking a moment just to tie up the rear portion of the exhaust. It goes all the way back to the muffler, and there's no support outside of what is provided by this coupling. So when I take this loose, I want to make sure it isn't damaged. So this is tied up. I'm going to proceed to take these bolts out next. I've made a good attempt here to try to remove the bolts off of the exhaust system right in front of the catalytic converter. The bottom one there that you see did come off. That one there broke in half. And the one up there appears to have been welded to the flange of the Y exhaust pipe. So I'm going to have to get a pair of, or a Sawzall, and cut that one off. And so I'm going to move on to the next step and come back here. Not shocked. Exhaust systems are always like this. And so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next step. And the next step I need to work with is removing the, removing this access plate here, so that I can gain access to the torque converter studs. Hope you can see that. And then also removing the starter so that it is out of the way right up in there. So I want to do both of those items so that they're out of the way, and then hopefully I'll get the Sawzall and get back to work on the exhaust system. Okay, so I've got the starter out. I just wanted to show you exactly how it's secured to the transmission. 3 bolts secure it to the bell housing of the transmission. You actually don't have to remove the starter completely. I could have just unbolted it and then simply tied it up, but mine is so covered in grease. The previous owner did a lot of off-roading, I think, and so a lot of mud, a lot of oil on my starter. So what I did is went ahead and disconnected the electrical connections, which are just 2 here and here, and removed the starter. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up and put it in a little better shape before I reinstall it. But the starter's out. Also, the plate that came off the bell housing is here, and that allows me access to the torque converter bolts, actually nuts, and so be doing that soon, but the plate is now off. So the only thing left is just to take care of that exhaust, and as soon as I get that cut off, then I'll be able to remove the catalytic converter and then move forward to the support that holds the transmission and the rest of the bolts that actually attach it to the engine. So we're getting pretty close, and shoot some more footage shortly. Okay, the next step that I have to do is to remove the nuts that secure the torque converter to the flywheel of the engine. There's the compartment there that was sealed earlier by a plate. There are 4 bolts. I believe it's a 9/16 inch socket, so I'm going to loosen those. And then after they're loose, I will turn the engine. We removed the spark plugs earlier, so that should happen freely, and remove them individually. Once that's done, we can begin working down here on the brace. And then once the brace is out, the final step of the transmission removal will be to remove the bolts that actually hold it to the engine block. There's one there. There's some other that come in from the other side. So that's where we are. Okay, the next thing we want to take care of is the downflow oxygen sensor, located behind the transmission, about where the transfer case used to be, and that simply unscrews from the exhaust. And still working on the exhaust bolts that attach the Y pipe to the catalytic converter up front, but this seems like the next logical thing to take off. Okay, the next item I want to take care of are the linkage and electrical connectors going to the transmission. So I'm going to take a screwdriver, flathead, and just simply pry off this connection to this ball joint. This is the shifter cable and linkage. I'm going to unplug this blue connector going to the transmission, and also this black connector. This is the range sensor. I was able to remove the linkage without removing this bracket. The unit has some tabs on the side here that you can squeeze and slip out of the transmission, so the linkage does not need to come out with the bracket. Also, on the other side of the transmission, where the O2 sensor plugs in, so I can see it back around here. I don't know if you can see or not, but I need to dismantle or take off the connector that's attached to the top of the housing for the O2 sensor. So really simple, just pry it out of the little bracket there. It's just plastic. So all the electrical connections are taken off. One thing left is just to finish up that exhaust that's being a little stubborn, and then we'll proceed with removing the bracket. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is to drain the transmission pan. And I'm choosing to do this because I believe that when I dismount the transmission here in a moment, I'm going to get a lot of fluid pouring out of the back. And it's just going to be a mess. So I'm going to choose to go ahead and drain this and try to make this as least messy as possible. So we'll start at the back of the pan and remove the bolts around the back, and then loosen the ones that come around the front. It allows the pan to tip backwards, and it allows for most of the fluid to drain out of the back of the pan into something that you can catch it with. This is always a mess. There's no easy way to do it, but hopefully it'll be less messy than dealing with it when the transmission actually is pulled out. Okay, I finally got that pesky catalytic converter taken out. Two of the bolts, as you can see, were just really rusted up. There was just no way to get them out easily, so I ended up doing a lot of drilling and cutting. Salvaged one of them. So the next step is going to be to disconnect the lines going into the transmission. Those lines are right there. So they're held on by a single nut. Should unscrew fairly easily, but probably will make a mess in doing so. And then I still have to get this Y pipe out. Those two bolts there going to the exhaust manifold are frozen pretty well, so I'm trying to be patient with those and work those out slowly. So as soon as I get the lines disconnected and I get this Y pipe all taken out, not too bad, then the last thing to do would be to remove this brace across here with the transmission jack underneath. Should be getting pretty close. Okay, so these are the two fairly large bolts that hold the transmission to the support we've been looking at and talking about. The grommet there is what the catalytic converter portion of the exhaust attaches to. So I just took those two bolts off. Let me show you where they came from, so you'll have an idea what to do next. Okay, so there's the rear of the transmission here and here. So now the transmission is sitting on the support here, but is not attached to it. So as soon as I get the last of the exhaust out, the Y pipe up there that's still being fussy, then I'll be able to support this with the jack and remove the center support. Okay, so I finally got the exhaust out. It was very, very difficult. What I ended up doing was removing the manifold from the engine heads on the passenger side, because the bolts just simply were not gonna give up. So that worked out pretty well, and it really wasn't too troublesome, and so that's taken care of. So the only thing left now is to begin the actual removing of the transmission. So let me let you take a peek at what I've done under here. Got the transmission jack in place, and so it's underneath the pan, and I've tried to center up as best I can the guiding supports. Now the Ranger has a protrusion on the bottom of the pan, and so it doesn't sit perfect on the jack, but not bad. And then also I've got a jack underneath the oil pan to give the engine some extra support as we remove the load of the transmission. It also removes some of the support from the engine. So next, need to remove on the support here those two bolts. One more bolt. I don't know if I can capture it or not. Let's see. It's up there somewhere. Ah, there it is. Right there. Comes from the other side. So those three on each side, and then I'm going to remove this center support and drop it out of the way, and then the weight of the transmission will be on the jack, at least the back half. Then the last step will be to manage these jacks and crawl under there and begin to loosen and remove the 6 bolts that hold the bell housing to the engine. 2 come from the engine side, 4 come from the bell housing and transmission side. All of them are from the middle portion up. So below center line, there are no bolts that hold the transmission to the engine. They're all from the center line north. And so it's going to take some real effort to get those out, but hopefully be able to extract those. And when those come out, I can simply slide the transmission back, disengaging the torque converter from the flywheel. The bolts are already off. And then lower the transmission, and it should be out. So I'll post a video as soon as I have those items taken care of. Okay, a couple of items here as we're removing the transmission. The dipstick guide tube has to come out, and it is taken out when you remove this bolt from the transmission housing. So once you get that bolt out, the bracket is of course loose, and then this just wiggles free from the actual portion on the transmission. This guy right here. Okay, so that's done. Also, I want to give you an idea of, I've got 3 out of the 6 bolts off. So I want to give you an idea of kind of how I'm doing it. I'm sure there are better ways. It's pretty challenging. I'm using this 15 millimeter socket that is got an embedded universal joint, because you never have a straight shot at these bolts, especially at the top of the transmission bell housing. Those are quite challenging. Connected to that, I have 2 extensions. I guess all together, probably looking at about at least 3 feet. I am using a 3/8 inch drive. All I have are hand tools, so this is all I've got. And then I add this jack handle to give me some leverage. It's a bit of a contraption, but to be honest with you, there's not a real good way to get to those bolts. You just have to work with what you've got, the space you have. Generally what happens is a lot of pressure, a pop where the bolt breaks free, and then it slides out from there. It screws out from there pretty easily. These are unlike the exhaust bolts that are rusted. They're not rusted, they're just tight. And so that's the setup that I have. I've got 1 more on the bell housing, and then 2 that come in from the engine side. Hopefully those look a little easier to get to, I think. And then I should be ready to slide the transmission out. Okay, so transmission rolled out. Didn't have any problems once I had gotten all the bolts loose. I took a pry bar, but it slid out very, very easily. A couple of notes. First, as I was lowering the transmission, I had to ensure that none of the electrical connectors got caught, especially in this line here, because they were actually routed underneath it. So I had to kind of work through that a little bit. But it came out. A couple things now I want to do. So the next thing I need to do is service the transmission lines and cooler. So with compressed air, and I'll show you that in just a moment, I'm going to blow air through the line and flush out all the old transmission fluid. And then using this product, I'm going to run it both forward and backward through the line to try to ensure that all the old clutch material and old transmission fluid is clear from the cooler radiator portions. I also thought it might be a good time just to take a look around now that the transmission is out, and might help you just to see where everything was bolted and some of the work left to be done to get it back together. And let me get oriented here. Okay, so there's the flywheel. Up top you can see where the bolts were, here and here. This is the starter location. There's the O2 connector here on the other side. Okay, so I'm going to just spend some time getting all this cleaned up. Let's get everything wiped down. Hasn't been touched in 15 years, so it's probably a good time just to do some cleaning. Flush out the cooler lines. I'll shoot a video on actually doing that. And then it'll be time to start thinking about putting it back together. Okay, so I'm beginning to work underneath the truck now, preparing for the new transmission. And I've purchased this item here, Cooler Clean. Goes by a couple of different names. There's some other products as well that are similar. You'll notice it has a hose on the end, and you simply connect the hose to the transmission lines. Empty about half the can. Be aware that when you're pushing this through the lines, the old transmission fluid and cleaner is going to be coming out the other side, so I put a bottle over it and tried to capture that so it didn't spray all over me. And then after that I switched and did the other side like this. And then what I've done is taken some compressed air because I want to remove all the residue, the cleaner. I really want to have just empty lines if I can. So with some compressed air, I've done the same by inserting it here, blowing the cleaner out. And obviously you want to use pretty low pressures, 20 psi or so as you're cleaning this out. So that should take care of any old clutch material and used transmission fluid in the cooler lines. You should be aware that if you don't do this step, you're likely to have a repeat failure on your transmission because if the transmission overheats, even if it's brand new, it would fail. So that's the cooler line cleaning. Next thing I'm going to do is just take some time and maybe just clean some things up a bit under here, and after that I think we'll be pretty close to being ready to install the transmission. Okay, got the transmission seated back, and I thought I'd spend a couple of moments just walking you through this procedure. I think it's important to have a high quality transmission jack. I don't think this could be done, maybe impossible or without great difficulty, without a transmission jack. My jack allows me to adjust tilt, height, and rotation, and that's important because over here there's a dowel on this side of the transmission and the other side that I have to hit. In the middle, the torque converter has to fit into the center of the flywheel, and then all four of the studs on the torque converter have to fit into the flywheel. And so it's just a lot of alignment and a lot of patience. It took me about 30 minutes, but the transmission jack was really helpful in making minor adjustments. So there we have it. I'm just getting ready to bolt it up. Okay, so I'm going to take a break here just to explain a couple of things. So underneath the truck, and it's easier to show you on this transmission that's come out, underneath the truck I have secured the two side bolts that come in from the engine side. And so I know now that the transmission is seated firmly into the flywheel. And then before I did anything else, I went to the front of the truck and made sure by turning the crankshaft that both the motor and transmission assembly turned freely. In other words, I don't have the torque converter in some type of bind where it can't get free, because that would be bad. And so it's easy to check at this point. So now the next thing I'm going to do is, working from the transmission side under the truck, I'm working my way back around the unit. Now remember, as I work around, there's some brackets that have to be included. So there is the bracket for the filler tube or the transmission dipstick. That one goes here. I've got this overflow line that has to be secured here, and you can tell both on this one and the other one it's going to be a little tricky to get that thing down. And then there's a wire harness one as well. Remember also at the top of the transmission there were some cabling secure locations, so one of the connectors goes here. But basically what I want to try to do at this point is I'm going to get all of the transmission secured mechanically, both at the bell housing and at that center support. And then I'll start working backwards with the electrical systems, and then we'll move back to the peripheral components. So that's where I am, and post something in a second. Okay, working at the back of the transmission here, putting on the brace. I've already got a lot of it in place, and then I realized and remembered that there's one bolt here for the transfer case, and there's not sufficient room between the brace and the transmission housing there to get the bolt. So that needs to be in place before I attach it to the brace here. I might actually have to take this back down. We'll see. But nonetheless, I'm glad I saw it at this point rather than getting too far along, and just want to make a note of that. Okay, so this transmission is secure in the truck now. Brace is all in place. So what I want to do now is just begin working on the electrical side. So here's the cable harness that's coming down. O2 sensors at the very bottom that goes across the transmission. There's the brace on the top of the transmission. There's the shift selector connector, and there's the main connector. And I just want to begin working across the transmission, plugging those in. Go ahead and put on the linkage for the shifter. I need to move back on the other side of the transmission and connect the lines so they are in place but are not tightened. And then I'll move all the way to the front of the transmission and connect all of the bolts to the torque converter, and that should take care of a lot of the transmission. It should be in really good shape at that point, so pretty pleased how things are going. Okay, so I just finished installing the nuts onto the torque converter through this window at the front of the transmission. So what I did was I started the nut using my socket and just hand tighten it as far as I could go. And then by hand, I turn the crank here to advance the flywheel and torque converter to the next location. Once I had gotten them all started, I then tightened them one by one. And really important, I made sure that the torque converter, flywheel, transmission was not in a bind. So even now, it spins freely. Of course, there's the tension of the pistons, and I mean, you're moving the whole engine, so there's some tension. But by hand, I can freely turn the whole unit, and all of those are now tight. I will say that of all the procedures thus far on this transmission replacement, this was by far the most stressful one, because I realized that if I drop that nut, I believe it goes down in the bell housing. And I'm not sure how you get that out, because the flywheel is sitting right there. So I was really nervous about that, but fortunately it didn't happen. If it does happen to you, I guess there's a chance you could retrieve it using the starter hole position and one of those magnetic extenders, but nonetheless, hopefully it won't happen to you either. So I'm going to go ahead and put the panel back over this, so that's out of the way, and then we'll move on to the starter next. Okay, just put the starter back in, held in by 3 bolts, 1, 2, and then one up top here, 3. I want to make a note on the starter. You have to actually install the electrical connections at the back. Not too good of a shot there, but electrical connections first before you bolt it in. I bolted it in first and then had no access to the rear of the starter. So it took a little time, but wasn't bad. It just took a little patience there to get that back in place. So starter's all back in. All the electrical connections are back in on the transmission. Linkage is hooked back up. So next thing I'm going to tackle is going to be installing the transfer case. I'll need the transmission jack for that, and we'll get that in place next. Okay, putting the transfer case back in, and I wanted to take a moment and just kind of show exactly how this would have to sit on the transmission jack. It's tipped at such a right angle to accommodate the front drive shaft that it's a bit challenging. So what I've done is, using some wood, built it up, made sure I had my chain really tight in place. Also remember there's a paper gasket here, and so I've got that in place, and I used a little bit of assembly lube to hold that to the transfer case so that it's manageable trying to get all this up in there. It's a challenge, but that's the way I've got it set up, and hopefully it'll go in. I'm going to put on the dampener here. Just 4 13mm bolts right into the back of the transfer case. Really easy. Okay, the front drive shaft goes in the same way that it came out. So you'll want to insert this end into the front rear end initially, And then work this into the transfer case. Remember the important marking you made, paint marking you made, to identify exactly where this is oriented to the transfer case and to the rear end coupling in the front. By the way, these are 8mm bolts here. Okay, the only thing I have left to install is the exhaust here, catalytic converter, manifold, and Y-pipe. I also have to go ahead and reinstall the spark plugs and attach the wires. Over here is just the manifold gasket and exhaust bolts, O2 sensor, and dipstick. So we're just about there. I'm not going to shoot video of doing each of those because I figure if you've made it this far, you would be able to install those things. I will shoot one other video of hopefully the truck up and running, just so you have an idea. I'm at probably somewhere between 20 and 25 hours on this installation of the transmission. Now, a couple of notes on that. I'm not a professional mechanic. This is in my home garage. And this is actually the first automatic transmission I've replaced. And so I've had to learn along the way. Also only have just hand tools, so no power tools during the removal or installation. And so at times that slowed things down. And then also made this this video, so that's taken a little bit of time as well. But probably 20 to 25 hours. Started on Monday, today's Thursday afternoon. And hopefully I'll have these last items installed this evening or first thing Friday morning. And we'll see how things go tomorrow morning when we first try it out. Okay, I've got all of the truck buttoned back up here. All the parts are back on. And so what I want to do now that I've got things buttoned up is I put 1 quart of automatic transmission fluid into the torque converter when it was initially installed into the unit, the transmission. And I put 4 quarts, getting ready to add a 5th quart. Then I'm going to crank it, let it run for a couple of seconds just to let it pump some of that fluid, and then continue adding maybe a couple more quarts, and then I'll let it run a little longer. I believe it takes 11 quarts. The research I did said 11, but I'm not sure that's perfectly accurate, so we'll see. But should be up and going here, or at least try to get up and going here in just a bit. Okay, so I've cranked the truck a few times, adding a couple of quarts at a time. I now have about 10 quarts in it. It appears on the dipstick that that's pretty close to full. I'm going to keep that real close eye on that. Put it in drive and reverse. Wheels spin forward and backwards, so no noises, no grinding. Sounded pretty good. So I haven't put it on a road test, but I'm pretty sure we're in good shape. And so I hope this video was really helpful to you. Remember that there are a lot more important things than trucks and transmissions. I'm a pastor and a Christian, and I want to encourage you to cruise over to my other couple of videos, take a peek at those. Hope this helped. Take care and God bless.